Imagine walking into a museum and seeing the earliest piece of Nintendo PlayStation hardware ever made, sitting behind glass. Not a replica, not a rumor, an actual prototype from the moment when Nintendo and Sony were still partners. That's the Nintendo PlayStation. The National Videogame Museum in Texas has officially acquired something called the Sony MSF-1, the oldest known Nintendo PlayStation hardware artifact in existence. And if you love weird gaming history, this thing might be one of the most important prototypes ever built. Like, comment, subscribe, let's get into it. Before the original Sony PlayStation existed, Sony and Nintendo were actually working together. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, Nintendo wanted to add CD-ROM technology to the Super Nintendo. At the time, cartridges were still the main format for games. But CDs were starting to look like the future. They had more storage, they had better audio, and full motion video. Not to say that the audio wasn't good on cartridges, because that's very nostalgic, but the quality of audio had improved with CD. So, Nintendo partnered with Sony to develop a CD add-on for the Super NES. And this project was known as the Nintendo PlayStation. Yes, that was the real name. The Nintendo PlayStation. Which, honestly, it sounds weird, but it doesn't sound weird. It sounds normal. It sounds like something that should have been. The Nintendo PlayStation. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. Put it in the comments. Is it just me that finds it oddly just normal? I don't know. Maybe in some other universe, in the multiverse out there, there's a Nintendo PlayStation. Now, here's where the story gets a little messy. In the early 1990s, Nintendo and Sony collabed on this CD-based system. But during a major industry event, Nintendo shocked Sony by announcing a different partnership with Philips instead. And if you know anything about Philips and Nintendo, you know the Philips CDI and how horrible the Zelda games were on it. So horrible that Nintendo really wants you to forget about them. I wish I could forget about them, but I can't. So Sony basically got blindsided. The collaboration collapsed, and Sony decided, fine, we'll make our own console, which eventually became the PlayStation that launched in 1994 and completely changed the gaming industry forever. So this weird failed partnership is actually the origin story of PlayStation itself. And this is where the newly discovered hardware comes in. The museum didn't just acquire a random prototype. They acquired the Sony MSF-1. I know. MSF-1. It sounds so top secret. The device is believed to be the earliest surviving Nintendo PlayStation development system ever discovered. Even crazier, it's reportedly the only known unit in existence. Unlike the famous Nintendo PlayStation prototype that looks like a hybrid console, the MSF-1 is something completely different. It's essentially a developer unit that connects to a Super Nintendo through the cartridge slot and was used to test Sony's planned CD-ROM technology. In other words, the thing isn't a finished idea, it's the very beginning of the idea. If you look at photos of the MSF-1, it honestly looks more like a weird Super Nintendo science experiment than a console. The hardware includes a cartridge pass-through slot, connections for external hardware, development ports, and labels like MSF-1 and not for sale. And instead of a polished retail design, the system looks more like raw development equipment, which makes sense because this thing wasn't meant for stores. It was meant for engineers. This was all hardware developers used internally to experiment with the SNES CD system before the partnership collapsed. Now you might be wondering, why does this even matter? Because the Nintendo PlayStation story is one of the biggest what-if moments in gaming history. Think about it. If Nintendo and Sony had stayed partnered, there might never have been a PlayStation as we know it, or a PlayStation 2, or PlayStation 3, or PlayStation 4, or PlayStation 5. The entire console war might look completely different. So prototypes like this are basically artifacts from an alternate timeline. Nintendo PlayStation. The National Videogame Museum, located in Frisco, Texas, announced the acquisition in March of 2026. According to the museum, the MSF-1 is the oldest known Nintendo PlayStation hardware artifact and the original development system for Sony's planned SNES CD add-on. And the best part, unlike many prototypes that disappear into private collections, this one will be publicly displayed in the museum so fans can actually see it in person, which is a huge, huge win for preservation because gaming history disappears far too often. For collectors, the Nintendo PlayStation has always been one of the holy grails of gaming hardware. One of the known Nintendo PlayStation prototypes sold at auction for $360,000 a few years ago. And those were later prototypes. The MSF-1 might actually be older than all of them, which makes it less of a collectible and more of a historical artifact. It's basically the prototype of a prototype. And this historical artifact belongs in a museum. I feel like Indiana Jones. Anyways, over on Reddit, the news immediately blew up among retro gaming fans. In one discussion thread, users pointed out how crazy it is that this hardware represents the moment that ultimately created PlayStation. One commenter summed it up perfectly. Sony launching PlayStation literally changed the course of history. And they're right. This tiny piece of hardware represents a moment where the entire industry could have gone in a completely different direction. The Sony MSF-1 might not look impressive, it's not sleek, it's not shiny, and honestly it looks like, I don't know, someone duct taped a science project onto a Super Nintendo, but historically, it might be one of the most important gaming prototypes ever discovered, because inside that awkward hardware is the origin story of one of the biggest gaming brands of all time. Actually, two of the biggest gaming brands of all time, Nintendo and PlayStation. And now, instead of sitting in a private vault, it's preserved in a museum where fans can actually see it, which is exactly where gaming history belongs. In a museum. Dun 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 dun. Oh, don't do that. No singing. Sing the Indiana Jones theme to yourself. But I'm curious, what do you think? If Nintoni and Nintoni? Ha, Nintoni. I'm gonna leave that in. But let me start over. But I'm curious, what do you think? If Nintendo and Sony had never split up, would PlayStation even exist today? Or would we all be playing Nintendo PlayStation 5? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this weird retro gaming history thing that I do over here, don't forget to like and subscribe, because sometimes the strangest gaming stories are the ones that actually happen. And that's really cool. All right, bye.